Hello, and thank you for joining us for Talk of the Hill. I'm Charlotte Harper, Director of Programming at Hill Center. Hill Center is located in the Old Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C. But while our city and our country deal with the coronavirus outbreak, we have remained closed. So we come to your home from our homes. Thank you for joining us. Bill Press talks with Molly Ball, national correspondent for Time and author of Pelosi, a new biography of the Speaker of the House. We encourage you to purchase this book through your local bookstore or our local bookstore, East City Bookshop. The link will be provided to you in the email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this special Zoom edition of Talk of the Hill. I know you're all itching to get out like I am, but meanwhile, I hope you're staying safe, staying strong, practicing your social distancing, and wearing your mask. And we're very excited to welcome today to the Talk of the Hill a good friend of mine, the national political correspondent for Time magazine. Molly Ball is also a contributor to CNN, and Molly Ball is the author of the wonderful new book about Nancy Pelosi called, of course, Pelosi. It is just out this week. I've read it, I have to tell you. It's a great book full of great stories and great insights into a person who is clearly the most powerful woman ever in American politics. Molly Ball, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Great to see you, Bill. Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to start at the end because I was struck in the afterword to the book where you say that about Nancy Pelosi, you don't have to agree with her to respect her accomplishments and appreciate her historic career. So in spending almost 2 years writing this book, interviewing Nancy Pelosi several times, looking at her career, talking to a lot of her friends and associates, what did you discover to be her strengths and then her weaknesses?
Well, a few things about her career that I think can be appreciated by partisans of all stripes. And in fact, I do know some Republicans who do, if not admire her, respect her skills. One is just her incredible effectiveness as a legislator. If you talk to, scholars of Congress, they will tell you that probably not since LBJ or Sam Rayburn has there been a legislator who was simply as good at managing the process, getting big pieces of policy through the Congress, being effective in leading both their caucus and the House as a whole. And then the fact that she's the first woman speaker is not something that should be underestimated. It was hard for her to get there. She remains the only woman who's ever led a party in the Congress. 100 years after women got the right to vote, she is the only woman who has been at that table of congressional leadership, and that's a remarkable feat. And she had to really fight to get there. Keep in mind, when she got to Congress in 1987, she was one of 23 women in the 435-member House of Representatives. So she fought very hard to get where she is.
Right.
And she did it twice.
I'm sorry. Yes, right. It did it twice. Clearly the most powerful woman ever in American politics. Would you agree?
I think it's true just as a matter of her title. I mean, I suppose she's certainly the most powerful politician in elective office. You can quibble with, does a governor have more power at their disposal on a day-to-day basis? Does the Secretary of State perhaps have more latitude in terms of foreign policy? But in elected national political office, there isn't anyone, I think, more powerful than the Speaker of the House. She's second in the line of succession to the presidency. And you can see simply by the list of things that she's accomplished, that incredible power that she's had to shape the policies that affect all of our lives.
And she gets the title from several people, as you mentioned in the book, Master Legislator. Has there ever been a more effective Speaker of the House?
Well, again, I'm not expert on congressional history, so I don't know how to, but I certainly have spoken to several people who were around for the past few speakers, who are around for the Gingrich speakership, the Tip O'Neill speakership, even some of the speakers of the past century. And she stacks up against them pretty impressively, especially when you consider the changes that have occurred in politics and in Congress during the time she's been there. She was in Congress for that, Newt Gingrich Republican Revolution in 1994, which is where a lot of scholars today and experts today trace a lot of the current dysfunction and partisanship and polarization to. So she's come to power in an era where it has been harder and harder for a lot of reasons for Congress to get anything done. And yet she's been able to get a lot of things done.
So I first met Nancy Pelosi when we were both active in Democratic politics in San Francisco. She is known, rightfully so, as a San Francisco Democrat. But as you point out, that's not where she started, right? It all began 3,000 miles away from San Francisco. Tell us about that.
That's right. She was born and raised in Baltimore, where her father was a member of Congress when she was born. And when she was 7 years old, he became the mayor of Baltimore. Uh, she actually swore him in for his first term as mayor, and it's one of her favorite early memories. And wrote the speech that he gave with help from the nuns at her Catholic school. So, she was very much shaped by that world of old school white ethnic democratic urban machine politics. That was the tradition that her father was a part of. And I think it's kind of a handy metaphor for not just her career, but the transformation of the Democratic Party that has gone from being the product of some of these sort of old school urban machines to the sort of coastal urban liberal party that she sort of represents today and is a part of today. And she is a very interesting combination of those two profiles, those two skill sets. On the one hand, she knows how to count votes. She knows how to organize and work the levers of power the way her father did back in the old days. On the other hand, she's very much representative of her district in a lot of the causes that she's advocated and the things that she's worked on throughout her career, and certainly in the way that she has been some would say caricatured by the right as this sort of avatar of the far left and as you said the San Francisco Democrats.
Well, so I know a lot about her father, member of Congress and mayor, about her brother who was mayor. I didn't know until I read your book how important a force her mother, Annunziata, was in Nancy's political, let's say, education. And she, her mother, was really very much a part of the political machinery in Baltimore.
That's right. And I really did want to sort of recenter her mother in this narrative because when Nancy Pelosi talks about her, she talks about her as a partner in her father's political enterprise. But I think, for obvious reasons, not having had those titles in front of her name and the fact that Nancy Pelosi went into the family business, it's been natural for people to associate her with her father's tradition. But her mother was very important in her life. Her mother was sort of the brains of the political operation in a lot of ways, running the Baltimore Women's Democratic Club out of the basement of their row house in Little Italy, which was so crucial to getting out the vote in order to get her father elected. She also ran the so-called favor file, which was the sort of constituent services operation that was run out of the family parlor on the first floor, which meant, helping get people on welfare, helping get people into housing or into the hospital, and then knowing how to cash in those chits when the time came. And the other thing that I think is significant, there's her mother has been described as a very strong-willed, even aggressive person, someone who was never afraid to get up in anybody's face. There's a story that she once even punched a poll worker who displeased her. So she was no shrinking violet, and I think you can certainly see that in her daughter, her only daughter out of 6 surviving children. But the other thing about her mother that I think really influenced Nancy Pelosi's worldview is the way that she was stifled, the way that she was not allowed to achieve her goals and dreams because she was a woman at the time. Her mother wanted to be an auctioneer, wanted to go to law school, wanted to start her own business, even invented and patented a beauty device. But in those days, you needed a man's signature to do something like that. And her husband, Nancy Pelosi's father, would not allow her to. So I think in in a lot of ways, Nancy Pelosi, at least earlier in her life, saw herself as sort of fulfilling the dreams that her mother was not allowed to, whether it was leaving home and going to college in a different city, or eventually climbing the political ladder and having her own title in front of her name instead of just being a Mrs.
And you point out that young Nancy D'Alessandro wasn't just around the house. I mean, she herself, right, participated in the political machinery that was going on at the house. And she must have learned a lot of lessons there in Baltimore that still are that she's kind of applying in her role as Speaker of the House.
I think that's certainly true when you look at a lot of the skills that she brings to the process. At the same time, I don't want to overestimate it, and I think she and people around her sometimes feel like whenever a woman achieves power and prominence, there's an attempt to find the men who taught her how to do it in a way that there isn't always with a male political figure. We don't always go rooting around in their past to find, who was the man who gave him these skills. So I'm certainly not accusing you of anything, but
Yeah.
I do think, when you think about leaving home at the age of 17 or 18, the things that you learn from your parents are really important, but they're not everything in life. And she did a lot herself to establish herself in politics and to learn things on her own.
Yeah, a couple of things. What I was really thinking about were, one, ability to count votes, which Nancy can count votes better than I think anybody else alive today, maybe, and also remembering people and giving people credit. And I'm sure that's something she learned from her mother too, right? And whenever I see Nancy in front of any group where there's any member of Congress, she goes out of her way to recognize each of those members of Congress and to say something good about each one of them.
That's
And
right.
you
And
point
that's not necessarily something that a lot of politicians are good at, right?
right,
Politicians are really into their own power and their own ego. They're not always so good at sharing credit. But she has always realized that the key to her own power, particularly in the House, right, where you have to have the votes and the support of your caucus, is making your constituents basically feel represented. I think it also goes back to her effectiveness as a young mother. She had 5 children in 6 years after getting married right out of college. And she was, by all accounts, a tough but very effective leader of the family. And I think when you are trying to get children to do what you want them to do, whether it's clean their rooms or fold the laundry or just put their shoes on and go outside, uh, you can't have your ego caught up in it, right? You've got to always be giving positive reinforcement in order to kind of get people all on the same page and marching in the same direction.
right. And she certainly knows how to do that. So she moved, as you point out, she moves to San Francisco with her husband, Paul, banker, investor, venture capitalist. And Nancy gets involved in politics, but she didn't decide to run for office. It sort of came to her getting involved um, in politics. Tell us how that happened.
Well, she has always described herself as a sort of accidental politician, someone who never saw herself seeking political office herself. She saw herself as a strategist, someone who might operate behind the scenes, a fundraiser, a party operative. As you well know, but before she ever ended up running for office, she was well known as a fundraiser
Hmm.
on the national circuit as well as the California circuit, and also was a top party player who was chair of the California Democratic Party, the largest Democratic Party in the country, uh, made a failed bid for chair of the DNC, helped bring the 1984 Democratic Convention to San Francisco. She was already a player, but she always said she never wanted to be an elected office herself. And in fact, over the years that she was doing those things, many people asked her to run for office, and she always said no. It wasn't until in 1987, her good friend Sala Burton, the widow of the former Congressman Phil Burton, was dying of cancer and called her to her bedside, uh, and implored her to run for the seat in Congress after she passed away. And so, having made that dramatic deathbed promise to her close friend, Nancy Pelosi felt duty bound to follow through. And I think one thing that I have learned observing Nancy Pelosi is she doesn't do anything halfway. She wasn't going to just take a stab at it and maybe it would work out and maybe it wouldn't. She put her whole self into it, and it was a tough campaign, but it's the only tough campaign she's really had in her life. Ever since then, she's had a pretty firm grip on a safe seat in Congress.
And it was at that time, there are two or three adjectives about Nancy I wanted to ask you about, but Phil Burton, who was Sala's husband, a longtime congressman from San Francisco, said about Nancy, she was operational, which to him was the greatest compliment you could make of a politician. What's he mean by that? And how do you see Nancy as operational?
Yeah, I argue in the book that this is the single best word you can use to describe Nancy Pelosi. And it is a great compliment coming from Phil Burton, because what he meant was someone who cares about getting results more than anything else.
Gets things done.
Someone who gets things done, and someone who who knows how to work the system to get things done. Someone whose first priority is not whether people like them or how they look in the press or anything like that, but are they achieving their political and policy goals? Are they improving people's lives through the policy process? And that was something that he saw in Nancy Pelosi.
Right. And for example, would there be an Affordable Care Act today without Nancy Pelosi?
I think it's quite likely that there would not. I think her skill at getting that legislation through the House was crucial to the effort. Not only that, but there was a moment when the Obama White House was tempted to back away, when it looked like the effort had failed, when they'd gotten one bill through the House and another bill through the Senate, and then the Democrats lost their 60th Senate vote with the defeat of the Democratic candidate in the Massachusetts Senate election. And you had a lot of Barack Obama's political advisors, such as then Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, saying, this is too heavy a lift, it can't be done, it's unpopular, the public is sick of it, let's just do something smaller and move on. And it was really Nancy Pelosi who said, look, this is something Democrats and Democratic presidents have been trying to achieve for the better part of a century. We have the potential here to do something truly historic. We can't stop now. And so she actually, she turned to President Obama in a meeting in the Oval Office, and she said, Mr. President, I know some people are urging you to take what she called the namby-pamby approach. But I don't think we should stop now. And he agreed with her, and I think that was a big reason. And she had to give a pep talk of similar proportions to her own caucus, because it had been so hard to get the legislation through the House in the first place, and then to have to go back to them and say, actually, we're going to have to pass a bill you like even less, mm-hmm. was a really Herculean feat. And it speaks to the credibility she built up with her colleagues, that they were willing to follow her down that path.
So operational, that's one word. The other word I hear a lot with regard to Nancy Pelosi is underestimated. And I think, as I see, she's been underestimated, and from your book too, from the very beginning when she arrived in Congress, and then she became whip and she became majority leader. And you tell a story about how Tom DeLay learned himself the hard way not to underestimate Nancy Pelosi.
Yes, this is when she had just become the minority leader. So the leader of the Democratic minority in Congress, and Tom DeLay was the majority leader, and the speaker at the time was Denny Hastert. And they were apportioning the new committees, and she had received a promise in writing from the speaker that the committees would stay the same size, and she had just finished appointing the Democrats to the important committees, and only to get a call from Tom DeLay saying, hey, actually, we think we're going to reduce the size of this committee. It shouldn't be a problem, right? And she said, no, it is a problem. I have a promise right here from the speaker. And he's sort of wheedling her and trying to talk her into it. And she stops him and she says, life on this planet as you know it will not be the same if you persist in this notion. And
Wow.
it's such a classic Nancy Pelosi utterance. I think probably many members of her caucus and the opposing caucus have heard versions of it over the years. And it's really, it really speaks to her toughness, her steeliness, her unwillingness to back down. And I think a lot of other leaders might have let something go over a handshake or the proverbial cigar in the smoke-filled room. And she's never been that kind of leader. She's very tough, and she's been underestimated throughout her career, partly because she's a woman and people weren't sure whether to take her seriously as this sort of rich fundraiser from San Francisco. But I think it also ties into that fact of being operational. The fact that she was always more focused on results than on appearance meant that it was easy for people to underestimate her because they often didn't see how much effort she was putting in behind the scenes or how much of a particular successful piece of legislation had to do with her, as opposed to all those other people up on the dais that she insisted on giving credit to.
Right. And in fact, in that case, it was a Tom DeLay who backed down.
And Tom DeLay learned never to underestimate Nancy Pelosi again.
And I guess the third word is, and I don't know whether I would say determined or to use Mitch McConnell's word, persistent. But there have been so many occasions, as you point out, where the Democrats, she's speaker, they lose the House. Hillary Clinton's going to be elected, she loses, in times in between when there was so much pressure on her to get out of the way, even a rebellion inside of her own caucus, and so many opportunities where people thought Nancy would just fold and quit and walk away, and she never did. She hung in there, and now she's speaker again. What keeps her going?
Well, she would say her answer to this question is always the children, the children, the children. She always says that is her why for being in politics, is improving the lives of America's children and children around the world. Now that's kind of corny, and obviously people have other motivations. And it's some combination of that toughness, that stubbornness, that unwillingness to let anybody else decide her fate for her. She's going to decide herself. Thank you very much. And not wanting to sort of give her opponents the satisfaction of being able to drive her out of the game. A former aide to her once said everything she does is rooted in this combination of obligation and confidence, right? This feeling that somebody has to do this and I am the one who can do it. So pretty much everything she does. So I think she looked at the House, say, after the Democrats lost it in 2010, and the prospect of going from Speaker of the House to Minority Leader is a very unpleasant one. And most people assumed that she would take the opportunity to enjoy a nice retirement. But I think she looked at the situation and said, well, somebody has to lead the Democrats in the minority, and I'm the only one who can do it. The other people who are available to do it are not going to do the job the way I think it ought to be done. And so year after year, she's very tenacious. She's very patient. And so even as, that frustration and angst within the Democratic caucus has grown, in part because she and her two lieutenants have been in charge of the House Democrats for more than 15 years now, she doesn't step aside because she, I think, doesn't see someone else that she feels can do the job.
Right. And also I've heard her say, and you point out in the book too, that if she were to walk away, there would be no woman at the table.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to her, the fact that she is the only woman ever to lead a party in the Congress means that when the president meets with the top congressional leaders, she is the only woman in the room, and she has been throughout her career. And it's been remarked upon in some of those photos of, her standing up to Trump in the White House. But that's not a new feeling for her. It's basically been her whole career. After the 26 election, she told me and a few others that she would have considered stepping aside if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency, because there would be a woman at the table. Now, who knows? Nobody heard her say that before the election, so who knows if she really did have that intention. But I do think it is important to her that women's voices be represented, and she takes seriously the fact that if she weren't there, it would be a room full of men.
Right. So in 2018, when Democrats in charge, and there's sudden this whole new burst of energy, and in terms of these younger members being elected to Congress, a total different generation than Nancy Pelosi, a lot farther to the left, maybe that at least publicly than Nancy Pelosi, the Squad and AOC and all the names that we know. How did Nancy deal with them?
Well, her public posture is she loves seeing young progressive women in Congress, and she has done a lot to increase the number of women in Congress, which, having been 23 when she got there, is now over 100 for the first time in history. And she's been a big part of recruiting and encouraging women to run. And as you sort of alluded to, I think she would quibble with your premise that the energy is primarily on the left, because the reason Democrats have the majority in the House is primarily because of more moderate members who are able to win swing districts and take seats away from Republicans, rather than win a primary for a safe Democratic seat the way Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did.
Right.
But it very much is of a piece with her MO that the day after Joe Crowley, one of her friends and loyal lieutenants, lost his primary to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. 1 minute she was on the phone commiserating with Joe Crowley. A few hours later, she was on the phone welcoming Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and saying, I love seeing new progressive women in Congress. Thank you for having the courage to get into the arena, and let's see what we can do together. So, there have been some high-profile clashes between her and that left flank of the party, but I think it's important to remember that not only do they not necessarily represent the sort of part of the Democratic caucus, they don't even necessarily represent the progressive part of the caucus, because the Congressional Progressive Caucus is much bigger than those 4 members that I think Nancy Pelosi regards as a sort of a relative fringe.
Right. Molly Ball, a national political correspondent with Time Magazine and CNN contributor, is the author of the great new book, Pelosi. You'll see a copy of it right there in back of Molly, with Nancy Pelosi with the red coat stepping out of the White House, Molly, after maybe one of Donald Trump's most awkward moments, right? That he sort of downplayed her importance and she let him have it. Tell us that story.
Yeah, it really tells you everything you need to know about sort of the relationship between the two of them and what she has come to signify in our current political moment. I think a lot of people remember that code and remember that moment because this is December 2018, shortly after those midterms have elevated Democrats to the majority in the House, but before Nancy Pelosi has managed to secure enough votes to guarantee that she will return to the speakership. So she's in the middle of this tough battle inside the caucus with a few determined opponents who would like to see a different, fresh face atop the Democratic Party. And meanwhile, she is trying to negotiate to keep the government open. And so she and her Senate counterpart, Chuck Schumer, go into the White House to negotiate with Trump. And rather than a closed-door negotiation that they were expecting, Trump invites the cameras to stay in the room. And then in the course of this conversation about whether there should be a border wall and so on, Trump says, well, Nancy can't really talk right now. She's got a tough situation with her own people. And she stops him. She interrupts him. She's never been afraid to interrupt a man who was talking over her, and said, Mr. President, please don't characterize the strength that I bring to this meeting as the leader of the House Democrats who just won a big victory. So that was her laying down a marker and saying, American people have vested me with this authority, and you're not going to tell me how much power I have. And so that was one moment that was really resonant, just that quote, her saying that. And then, getting up, walking out of the White House, putting on that red coat and those tortoiseshell sunglasses and smiling that little sort of self-satisfied smile. For a lot of people on the left especially, it was the first time they'd seen anyone stand up to Trump in that way. And so it was sort of symbolic of the whole political current that swept the Democrats into the House majority, that people could finally see a countervailing force in the national government to stand up to Trump and say, you don't get everything you want, you have to deal with us now. And then just the image of, being a woman standing up to a man in that way, I think resonated with a lot of people as well. And it really, I didn't design the cover. I love the cover of my book. I think it's beautiful, but it also speaks to the way that her image has turned around in this moment, as so many people have come to appreciate what she stands for.
Right. And we've seen several moments since the famous clap during the State of the
Well
Union.
done. You look just like.
The Union address, the time when she walked out of a meeting in the cabinet room and said, "All roads with you lead to Putin," paraphrasing a little bit, and also when she ripped up his speech after the last State of the Union. More than anybody else, she has a way of getting under Donald Trump's skin, doesn't she?
She really does, and many of his people have also said that he seems a little bit afraid of her in the way that he doesn't a lot of other politicians in either party. She just seems to have his number, and it goes back to the very beginning, shortly after the inauguration, when all of the congressional leaders went to the White House for the first time, and they're all sort of politely mingling, and Trump is going on about how he says, I really won the popular vote. And everyone else sort of smiled and nodded, even though they knew it wasn't true. And it was Nancy Pelosi who spoke up to say, "Mr. President, that isn't true."
Mm-hmm.
So I think the fact that she has always been willing to interrupt, stand up to him, tell him that he's not telling the truth to his face, he's always had a little bit of grudging respect for her strength, for her toughness.
Right. And you end the book when Nancy Pelosi holds a news conference to announce that the House is going to begin the impeachment of Donald Trump. Is that do you end there because that's the peak of her career, her greatest accomplishment?
Way to spoil the ending, Bill. No, I mean, I ended it there, honestly, partly for logistical reasons, because I was on a book deadline, and she's still in office, and events are, continuing to happen even as I'm trying to write the book. But I actually think it was a fitting moment, not because it's the capstone to her career and will be her legacy. She believes, and I think she's probably right, that the Affordable Care Act will be remembered much more than the impeachment of Donald Trump as a sort of landmark in American legislative history. But at the same time, I did think it was a fitting moment to juxtapose the things that she stands for, the institutionalist, she's giving this speech about the founders and the Constitution and the bedrock of democracy, and the juxtaposition of that to the sort of chaos represented by Trump. It really is the sort of ultimate confrontation between the political forces that are shaping the present moment, and it's the sort of climactic moment in that regard. So I did think it was a fitting way to end it, even though I kind of had to end it there anyway.
And finally, what did Nancy Pelosi tell you about how long she's going to be in office?
She does not talk about that, and she gets annoyed if you mention it. But I do reveal in the book that, in order to regain the speakership after 2018, she had to negotiate with all these different factions in the caucus. And one of the concessions that she made was a term limit. She agreed that she would stay on not past 2022. And then she went into her next meeting laughing because she said, "Well, I was only planning to stay one term anyway." So, and this is a signature negotiating tactic of hers, the fake concession. I feel like I've learned a lot about how to negotiate with my young children from watching her. And so one of those tactics is to pretend you're giving up something that really matters to you when actually it doesn't mean anything to you at all, or you'd already given it up in your mind. But I don't know if that's still her plan. And it's been very interesting to see after that hard-fought battle to regain the speakership, she's really brought around a lot of her former detractors, especially a lot of the moderates in the House who worried that, she made them look too liberal. It's a lot of those members who now are grateful for her leadership and the way that she's kept the caucus, in their view, focused on the mainstream instead of spinning off into left-wing world.
Molly Ball, thanks you so much for spending so much time with us today. Again, I know Nancy well. I've known her a long time. And yet there was so much in the book that I didn't know. And I thought you really captured her spirit and her energy, which is indefatigable, and her determination, the things that we talked about. Excellent job. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for joining us as well, regulars to the Hill Center, and remind you, East City Books has, they're closed, but they're doing a great business online and sending books out. So please order, I encourage you to order a copy of Pelosi. You'll enjoy it as much as I did, from East City Books. By the way, our next Hill Center event will be June 2nd with David Ignatius, Washington Post columnist, who has another new spy novel out. And we'll be talking to him about both foreign policy and that spy novel. Again, Molly Ball, great to see you. All right, stay safe, stay strong, and lots of luck with the book. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill.
Thanks.